Lebanon's economy collapsed in the year 2019. The government defaulted on foreign debt, the Lebanese pound crashed, and banks stopped allowing withdrawals of foreign currency.
Do you know which country has had one of the greatest worldwide economic crises since the middle of the 19th century? Whereas the GDP per capita fell by 36.5% between 2019 and 2021, the nominal GDP plunged from around $52 billion in 2019 to an estimated $23.1 billion in 2021. That is because Lebanon's economy may be the most hopeless in the world right now. Its citizens suffer from persistent food shortages, hyperinflation has engulfed the country and rendered its currency useless, and it has defaulted on substantial sums of international debt. The headline output statistics should make it very obvious how awful things are in Lebanon if it wasn't already clear enough. Lebanon's GDP has decreased by more than 50% during the past 2 years, from $52 billion in 2019 to $23 billion in 2021. Only Macau, a special economic zone rather than a country, technically beats this as the worst economic downturn in history. Why is the obvious subject on economists' minds everywhere? A massive portion of Lebanon's capital city, Beirut, was destroyed in an explosion that horrified the globe a year and a half ago. The explosion at Beirut's port resulted in 218 fatalities, over 7,000 injuries, and 300,000 people becoming displaced. After $15 billion in property damage, roughly half of the nation's yearly production at the time was caused. The region surrounding the port had to be rebuilt. The nation was doing pretty well for itself up until around 2017. It was expanding quickly, creating new industries, and raising the standard of living for its citizens. So what motivated economic progress in Lebanon during the previous 20 years? And why did it suddenly crumble? Finally, how did certain economies collapse so miserably that they cost the nation more than half of its overall output? After completing all of that, we may add Lebanon to the National Leaderboard of Economics Explained. It is significantly more challenging to grow a country's economy after a 15-year civil war, as Lebanon did in 1990. However, the nation did it. Regaining the capacity to collect taxes was one of the first actions the government performed. In the middle of the 2000s, there was some cause for concern over Lebanon's debt-to-GDP ratio. In contrast to other nations, it had risen by 150% by the year 2018. The government was spending more than it was collecting in taxes, which was a major cause of this. This led to huge fiscal deficits that were paid for through borrowing. The hefty interest rates Lebanon had to pay on its loans were another element causing the debt issue. The nation had to pay higher borrowing rates than other nations with stronger credit ratings because of its subpar credit rating. This increased the government's difficulty in repaying its obligations and rendered the economy even more vulnerable. Political unrest and corruption in Lebanon only served to deepen the country's economic predicament. The nation's political structure is sectarian, implying that several religious organizations compete for control. Politicians now prioritize defending the interests of their own group over advancing the interests of the nation as a whole as a result of this. Throughout its history, Lebanon has endured various difficulties, including protracted civil war that lasted from 1975 to 1990. Thanks to exports, remittances from Lebanese citizens living abroad, and international help, Lebanon's economy began to revive after the war. Despite starting from a poor baseline, the economy expanded by more than 4 times its actual economic production between 1990 and 2000. Lebanese banks were seen as a stable place to keep money, not just within Lebanon, but also across the Middle East. However, by the mid-2000s, Lebanon had a debt-to-GDP ratio of 183%, which was one of the highest rates in the world at the time. Generally speaking, any debt level close to or above 100% of GDP is considered high. Even internationally competitive manufacturing that makes use of the nation's inexpensive labor force needs to make some sort of investment. Only a small number of nations manufacture pricey equipment and tooling. Since nobody outside of Lebanon uses the Lebanese pound, it isn't probable that those nations will accept it as a payment. Therefore, the economy has to find some widely accepted money that it can use to buy the essential tools needed to launch its industry before even the most basic factory is established. Lebanon's long-term objective is to develop into an advanced economy such as those of Taiwan, South Korea, or Japan, who took on debt to expand their economies and ultimately became more secure and able to borrow money at cheaper interest rates. However, as the economy grows, it is susceptible to financial shocks brought on by both domestic and international events. Despite Lebanon's reliance on banking, domestic issues resulted in an economic catastrophe in 2019. Lebanon's economy was seen as a success story at the decade's conclusion. With the exception of the oil-rich states and Israel, it was ahead of the majority of other nations in the area, while not being wealthy by global standards. Even amid significant global economic crises, the nation had seen practically continuous economic development since the end of the Lebanese Civil War. Government corruption, strict social programs, and geopolitical conflicts with its more powerful neighbor went mostly overlooked during this period of relative prosperity. While living conditions were fast improving, people were prepared to put up with a lot, but the nation was still in a precarious situation. It was expanding quickly, but doing so at a high cost in debt. When Lebanon was overrun by more than 1.5 million refugees in the space of a year in 2018, the protracted civil war in Syria, which was backed through several intricate geopolitical channels in Lebanon and Iran's participation, erupted into full-blown humanitarian crisis. Their population graph, which also demonstrates how rapidly people are departing the nation, may be used to see this rapid population change in a very tiny country. Although US sanctions against some organizations in Lebanon imposed due to the Syrian crisis weren't particularly extensive or restrictive on their own, they served as the first catalyst for a chain reaction of negative economic effects. The US sanctions sparked concern regarding the sustainability of the Lebanese financial sector. The Lebanese pound has also been tied to the US dollar since 1990 at a rate of $1 for 1,507.5 Lebanese pounds. I'm not sure why that particular amount was chosen, but the set rate allowed individuals to profit from Lebanon's secure banking system and privacy regulations in order to successfully keep US funds. Because the government lacked the resources to honor all of these transactions, the currency lost its peg and fell in value on the international currency markets. Obtaining more loans grew more difficult and expensive as a result of the liquidity issues that increased the likelihood that the government would default on its debt. The government sought to impose taxes on cigarettes, voice-over internet calls, and petrol in an effort to increase income. This infuriated the populace, and minor protests gradually grew into violent riots, denouncing not only the taxes, but also the problems of economic mismanagement, rigid sectarian social policies, and corruption emerged. Again, many people were content to ignore these problems as long as the economy was still expanding quickly, but many of them snowballed on top of one another and began to undo all the advancements the nation had accomplished over the preceding 2 decades. Shortly after these protests, a covert lockdown began to affect certain sectors, including the nightly closure of the tourist industry, one of the nation's few remaining sources of foreign revenue. Next came the explosion. In actuality, the Lebanese economy had been in significant danger long before this catastrophe, but it wasn't until this moment that it became widely known how bad it was. Aiming to become the Singapore of the Middle East, the currency is now depreciating rapidly, the banking sector has failed, and the jobless rate is rapidly reaching 50%. Even international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, which work to assist countries in situations like this, struggle to provide assistance because the country's leadership continues to get involved in regional disputes while failing to meet basic requirements for economic management. As a result, Lebanon is now a failed state that has defaulted on its debts. If we put Lebanon on the Economics Explained national leaderboard, a country with a very good chance of being lowest on the list, starting as always with size. Lebanon has a GDP of $23.1 billion, which makes it one of the smaller economies in the world, roughly equal to the output of Albania and Malta. If we were measuring its score back in 2018, it would have got a nice healthy 5 out of 10, but now, after its recent economic collapse, it only gets 3 out of 10. Due to a number of issues, Lebanon's economy has been failing for years. Over the past 10 years, its GDP has decreased by 40%, and its economic policies have been criticized for being reckless and aggressive. As a result, the economy of Lebanon has suffered, with many companies finding it difficult to pay for basic imports, and the COVID-19 epidemic having a significant negative impact on tourism. Furthermore, the country's economic situation has made travel risky, and the financial sector has essentially failed. The total economic score for Lebanon is only 1.6 out of 10, making it the nation with the lowest ranking on the Economics Explained national leaderboard.